Hey everybody, welcome back to another chapter, another video in our ongoing exploration of the story by Randy Frazee. This time around, we are looking at chapter 21, which is entitled Rebuilding the Walls. This chapter serves as a wrap up to the Old Testament, or what sometimes we will call the Hebrew Scriptures. It is also tied in very, very closely. Perhaps we could even consider it a continuation of chapter 19, when we heard of the return of the Babylonian exiles, kind of, and the rebuilding of the temple. Now, when I say kind of, I mean that the Persians allowed the Jewish people to return, even though several generations had gone by and very few of the original exiles were still alive at that point. That's why I said sort of. But these two chapters are tied very closely in. The timeline where we're finding ourselves is approximately 50 years later after the conclusion of chapter 19, and once the temple had been rebuilt. But Jerusalem, the city, has not yet really been established. Mosaic Law, or the Torah, that's another way of saying it, is not really being closely followed, even though the temple has been reestablished. And the city, like I mentioned, is sort of there and sort of not. And so what we're hearing about today is really the rebuilding of the walls. We have an ongoing theme that's not only present in this chapter and chapter 19, but also in a couple of the other chapters that we've been in recently, of the Jewish culture finding favor with the Persian ruler, which we've seen in several different chapters, including the chapters that focused in on Daniel and the chapter that focused in on Esther, as well as these other couple of chapters. So we've been in this section that's very condensed in terms of a time period to a fairly short period of history in and around this time when the people had been taken off into exile and then begin to kind of repopulate the area. I suspect that this apparent favoritism that the various Persian rulers are showing has a couple of motivations. Now, these are just my opinions. Do not take these as fact, but these are kind of the things that I tend to think about. First of all, favor due to these various high-ranking Jewish individuals, like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Esther and Mordecai, some of those individuals that I mentioned. Because of their high status, that could be part of why these various emperors or kings, whatever we want to call them, are like, yeah, maybe we should be nice to the Jewish people. We kind of like them. It could also be the desire to win favor with conquered people from the previous empire. Think about it. These people who have been hauled off into exile had happened under the Babylonians. Now it's the Persians. It's a new empire that's come up and has supplanted them. And so this might be a way of being like, hey, those people that conquered you, yeah, they were bad. We're going to let you go. We're going to show you favor. Remember that we showed you this favor, and don't get uppity. I think that could also be a motivation. And then finally, a geographical motivation. Judah or Palestine or Israel or the Promised Land, whatever you want to call it, it is an important location as a trade route right along the Mediterranean, as well as up and down the Jordan River, that's a little ways inland. It's significant geographically because it's a connecting point between Africa and Eurasia, as we call it now, specifically the Egyptian kingdom or empire, which is down in Egypt, and then these various empires that are up farther into Europe and into Asia. So it's an important route, and because of that, having people there that are loyal to you is probably a good thing. So those are some of the possible motivations. Again, I'm not saying that that's the direct cause, but that's just kind of what I suspect. We've got some echoing themes of things that we've heard before. In particular, an interesting way of kind of a political type leader partnering up with a religious leader. Now, we really saw this back in chapter 19, in that previous chapter, when we had Haggai, the prophet, partnering up with Zechariah, the governor, to rebuild the temple and really kind of bringing these two spheres together. Now we kind of have a similar situation, not exactly the same, but definitely an echo. We've got Ezra, who is a priest, and his focal point is very much religious practice. And then we have Nehemiah, a more politically minded or military minded rebuilding type. And they are working together. Ezra, of course, is there first to and reestablishes the Mosaic Law, which we kind of mentioned. And then Nehemiah comes in and he's really focusing on getting the city reestablished. Now, the other important individual that we also hear about is Malachi. Malachi was the final Old Testament prophet, and his words wrap up the Old Testament. I can't also help but think that this dynamic between a prophetic type and a military or political leader type really is kind of reminiscent of what we heard back in the period of the Judges too. So again, we have these themes that kind of begin to repeat. That's something that we have seen oftentimes in a lot of the various chapters, and we've got some repeating echoes again here. I think something that's probably central to this chapter, and not just this chapter, but this whole little section, is the importance of having a central unifying focal point for a culture. I think that's probably why the temple was rebuilt first, because it's the temple of God, and within the Jewish culture, faith and all of culture are very, very closely tied, especially in their earlier history. But I think it's still important there. I think that's probably why it's rebuilt first, but then also that helps explain why the city is so important. This is Jerusalem. This is the city of David. It's a tie back to their past. And I think that perhaps can help explain some of the fervor for the work of those who are doing it and the intensity that they bring to it. And at the same time, knowing this idea of why is it so important to have a centralized thing that we're all focusing in on, I think their neighbors who were cranky with them probably also recognize that. And that's maybe why they want to try and trip this work up, because, hey, if we can get them to focus on something else, they're going to be scattered. They're not going to be as unified, and maybe it'll be easier to kind of keep them down that way. So I think that sensibility is lying under kind of all of this. I'm going to swing around now to things that make me go, and I've got a fair amount. First off, just an acknowledgement, the prophetic period is kind of hazy in my understanding, admittedly. It is a very, very wide swath of history within the Jewish culture, within the Old Testament history or the Jewish history. And it covers several different historical periods. Now, for me, some of them are more clear than others. But the prophets themselves, of which there are many, they have long served as the voice of God. Sometimes they're bringing warning or rebuke. Sometimes they're bringing encouragement and messages of patience and messages of return. We kind of get a wide swath in their various messages. Sometimes they're aimed at the Jewish culture and the Jewish people. Sometimes they're aimed at their neighbors. Again, very varied, extremely varied. One thing that I think is interesting as we consider all of this, and especially as we're really wrapping up this Old Testament period, it speaks to the Jewish understanding, again, my understanding of the Jewish understanding, let me be clear on that, into God's promises being more corporate than individual. And this is something that I've talked about in some past videos, that God remains faithful to the people as a whole, to the culture as a whole, even if centuries go by seemingly without God taking action. That it's not so much about God's promises to you as the individual, but it's God's promises to you as a people. I will not abandon you. I will be faithful to you as a culture. I think this also serves as a good reminder that the Jewish culture, the Jewish religion is far older than Christianity. Timelines are, of course, hazy, especially the farther back that we go, but it's going back thousands and thousands of years with some very substantial periods of quiet from God. Now, Malachi, again, marking the end of the prophetic writings, this marks another one, about 400 years of quiet before John the Baptist comes on the scene as the forerunner of Christ. Now, here's a caveat about that. Our faith, the Christian faith, is 2,000 years old, roughly-ish. And it has evolved. It has changed. Things have taken on new forms as we have gone through the centuries. Now, the Jewish faith has also experienced this, Though it's worth noting what we hear about Ezra specifically in the reestablishment of the Mosaic Law does seem to take things backwards. Like we need to get back to this reestablishment. Now, that in itself, here's where I'm really going, and I'm not offering condemnation. I'm not offering direction. I'm just acknowledging something that's in the ether that this makes me think of. This raises the question of fundamentals, which sounds an awful lot like fundamentalism, which doesn't always have the best connotation along with it. Now, we all have a different take on this. With perhaps a common thought. Now, when I think about the idea of the fundamentals, it's the idea of if like this is what's central, and if we can stick with what's central and important, everything else is kind of is not as important and not as vital. But the idea of fundamentalism is that this way is the right way back here, and we need to get back to that. We need to hold tightly to that, and no changes are possible. And that's where things get a little bit muddled, a little bit hazy, and I think sometimes people begin to butt heads over this because who is to say this is the right way and that's when we were doing it correctly? If the Bible, if the scriptures as a whole show us anything, is that very rarely are we doing everything correctly. And this is why we need the grace of God and the guidance of God, the guidance of the Holy Spirit to be with us. Now, as I wrap up this little thoughts that make me go, I'm thinking about where we're at now in the story. We're about to move into the New Testament. We're wrapping up the Old Testament, and our next video, our next chapter will be into the New Testament as we see God doing a new thing that inevitably is inviting our reality forward. Now, I'll wrap up by saying that it's my sense that that our faith shows us that the scriptures show us that God is continuously inviting the reality forward, inviting humanity forward into something new. And so that's just something to ponder. This is not to say that holding on to tradition is a bad thing. It's not. But remembering that sometimes God invites us into something new. That's everything I've got. Have a great discussion. Take care, everybody.